Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back for an afternoon of more invasive species action. We're here for our keynote presentation this afternoon on the impacts of aquatic invasive species with ties to the 24th International Conference on Aquatic Invasive Species. I'm excited to have with me here Jaimie Dick and Ross Cuthbert from Queen's University, Belfast. Jaimie Dick is a professor at Queen's University Belfast in the School of Biological Sciences, with more than 380 publications in journals such as Global Change Biology, Diversity and Distributions, and Freshwater Biology. Jaimie is a global expert on invasive alien species, both locally in Northern Ireland and worldwide. Jaimie is also a long-standing member of the International Conference on Aquatic Invasive Species International Scientific Committee, lending his expertise in aquatic invasive species to this internationally recognized biannual event. We're grateful to be working with both Jaimie and Ross to co-host the upcoming conference in Belfast, Northern Ireland in 2026. Ross Cuthbert is a lecturer at Queen's University Belfast in the School of Biological Sciences. He's also an associate editor at Marine Biology, a subject editor at Neobiota, an honorary research associate at the South African Institute for Aquatic Biodiversity, a member of the executive committee of the Young Academy Ireland, and International Conference on Aquatic Invasive Species International Scientific Committee member. His research interests broadly gravitate around global changes and their impacts on ecosystems, economies, and health, focusing mostly on biological invasions and disease vector biology. So I welcome Jaimie and Ross. Jaimie, you're welcome to share your screen now, and you can take it away from here.
Is that sharing okay?
Yeah, if you could just pop it into presentation mode, I can see it pretty well thus far.
Trying to get, is that better?
Perfect. It's amazing.
Great. Thanks very much for the introduction. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to do a little journey for you through the research that myself, Ross Cuthbert, and a whole range of people across the world, including a lot of Canadians, through the Canadian Aquatic Invasive Species Network, for example, with ICAIS and Ricciardi and other such characters. We've worked in South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. We're working across Europe. And I want to give you an indication and some examples of how we have moved from understanding the impacts of invasive species. Invasive species arrives, native species disappear. It's a very common pattern. But also how we're now turning this into a predictive science, that we can actually predict which invaders will have impact, how much impact they'll have, and how that impact will respond to, for example, climate change and all the environmental context dependencies that will come with climate change. So I'm going to start off by showing you a very high impact factor journal published in Britain called The Star. It's a newspaper which has these dramatic headlines, and this headline actually pretty much sums up everything I'm about to say, and that is that invasive species have impacts. They tend to impact on resources, and we can measure that with what we call the functional response, which is how resources are impacted by the individual invasive species as they consume local resources. Invaders are also abundant. They become widespread and numerous, and we can measure that with something we call in ecology the numerical response. And of course, as this rather daft headline shows, impacts can also be context dependent. That is, climate change, heat waves can bring in invasive species and allow them to thrive, and therefore they can have these per capita effects. They consume resources, and there's lots of them doing that consumption, and that interacts with things like climate change. So a silly headline, but very much wraps up quite a lot of what I'm about to talk about. To look at the science a bit more in depth, the functional response is simply a measure of how invasive species, or indeed any species, reacts to resource density. So as prey becomes abundant in the environment, how much prey is consumed by, let's say, an invasive predator or a native predator. And the The leap we made was to take what was very much a basic fundamental concept in ecology, measuring the functional response, such as this type 2 response here, where as, let's say, prey density increases, you get an increase in consumption up to an asymptote. And we hypothesized that perhaps what characterized invasive species, and in particular those invasive species having impact, was that they had a higher feeding rate, a higher attack rate, lower handling times of prey. And we hypothesized that the functional response of invasive species, as you can see, for example, with this type 2, would be higher than corresponding native species. The beauty of this is that this can be applied to absolutely anything that is living. Everything consumes resources in one way or another. And one of the features I've really enjoyed about this research and talking to so many different people is it has brought invasion ecology together. Because quite often the fish people don't speak to the insect people, the bird people do their own thing. The plant people, of course, are completely different to the animal people. And that, to me, has been a stumbling block in invasion ecology, that we haven't been united. But of course, everything that lives consumes resources. And therefore, this method applies across all taxonomic groups, all trophic groups, and that's the beauty of the method. And I hope to share some of our enthusiasm for that in this talk. What does it mean in detail, really? Well, you can measure prey density increasing and decreasing on an x-axis. You can measure, let's say, prey consumed, and you can measure things like the attack rate of the predator, the handling time, that is how much time it takes to consume, to swallow, to digest the prey. And essentially, that leads to an asymptote, whereby there's only so much you can eat per unit time as a predator or a consumer or a parasite or a competitor. And this then gives us a whole range of metrics that actually tell us about ecological impact. What is the impact of an invasive species coming in and consuming local resources at rates that may be very different to what those resources were used to in the past? Going back to the previous slide, you can see that we hypothesized that perhaps invasive species have special higher curves. They do more consumption per unit time than native species. That would explain a lot when you think of all the invaders that have come in and decimated local native populations. And in fact, we tested this idea very early on in about 2008, although early on, it was actually very late in the invasion science. Invasion science has been around for a long time and bizarrely hadn't transferred standard techniques like functional numerical responses into invasion ecology. So there had been a bit of a lack of translation of a standard technique in ecology into invasion ecology. And at the time I was studying around Western Europe, the killer shrimp, which is a large amphipod which has come across from the Ponto-Caspian zone into Western Europe. It's now in the UK, and basically decimated macroinvertebrate and fish populations as it spread through freshwater systems. Typical of invasive species, you all know other examples, and we'll see more here, of how invaders arrive and local species start to disappear. This was quite spectacular. These are photographs of insects that have been attacked by killer shrimp. You can see this mayfly's lost legs, bits of head. You can see the chew marks. You can see these mayflies here, all sorts of injuries. You can see these hog lice are all chewed up. The damselflies themselves, predators, have been partially consumed. And that was one of the characteristics of the killer shrimp. It tended to partially consume and kill a lot of prey. And it really does decimate. If you do this in mesocosms, as we did in Holland, killer shrimps will decimate a whole big aquarium full of invertebrates very, very quickly, and very more dramatically than the native shrimps, which is the comparator, the native co-evolved shrimps. So we tested the hypothesis, as I mentioned, that perhaps this is all entirely predictable. Perhaps the killer shrimp, by exhibiting this high rate of consumption, which we measured in the lab, we can understand why it is wiping out prey, because as we can see from this experiment, the killer shrimp's killing about 15 prey per unit time compared to the native species killing about 5 prey per unit time. So by measuring in the lab the functional response, the sort of killing rate of the killer shrimp versus the normal everyday native shrimp towards native prey, we revealed that perhaps the killer shrimp has novel weapons, perhaps the local prey are naive to this particular predator. And if you have a rate of consumption that's 5 times, 3 times, depending on the prey species, more than what the natives are exerting on the native community, then it seems quite obvious that could explain why the killer shrimp is having such impact. But of course, I turn that into another way of thinking about things, which is we could have predicted this. We could have simply taken these in the lab, measured their functional responses compared to our natives, and said, this is going to be a damaging species. So this is the one you want to stop getting in. And that's the beauty of this method, is it's not just about understanding retrospectively, it's about predicting what could happen in the future, which species will be nasty, which will be benign, what conditions species will have varying ecological impact under, such as climate change. Now that, of course, if you're a scientist, you'll say was an N of 1. It was a sample size of 1. We've done it once and it seemed to work. Is it general across species? So we set out to very much tackle this issue and ask, can we see this pattern or similar across a whole range of invasive species with a whole range of different impacts? And what was very satisfying was that a lot of people around the world began to use this technique. And this is a study done by the Chinese. After a talk similar to this, my Chinese now collaborators for many years went off and tested the hypothesis that the golden apple snail, which we all know is a really nasty invader in rice paddies, for example, across Asia, was it entirely predictable that the golden apple snail would have such impact on rice paddies? And basically, we measured plant biomass on the x-axis, increasing from low to high, and we measured plant consumption by the golden apple snail, another less damaging invader, and native species. And you can see the pattern very clearly, similar to the killer shrimp. The golden apple snail has a consumption rate way higher than the next nastiest invader, and much, much, much higher than the native species. So this was beginning to build a picture that perhaps this was a universal truth across species, taxonomic groups, trophic groups, not just predators, but herbivores, perhaps applied to parasites, perhaps applied to competition between species, as well as predatory impacts. And it really began to take off. I wasn't much of a plant invasion ecologist until a lady in Darwin, Australia, showed me, after again a talk like this, who'd been working on invasive gamba grass, that the plant people have been doing exactly the same as the animal people, but have a whole different literature, a whole different set of terminologies and words, and even statistical analyses. Essentially, they look at nutrient uptake across a gradient of nutrients on the x-axis, and nutrient uptake comparing, would you believe it, non-native invasive grasses with native grasses. They call these resource utilization curves. They use different statistical techniques, which essentially do the same as what we do in animal ecology, but they just have different names, which is why we weren't really talking, because we weren't talking the same language. But the universal truth emerged that nasty invasive plant species were better at accruing resources than native species, exactly what we've been finding with predator-prey relationships, for example. So we really began to build the idea that this type of metric, the functional response, was really good across taxonomic and trophic groups. Don't want to get into too many details and too many different metrics, but Ross and I came up with this other idea that we could sort of heat map functional responses. So you can look at very benign consumers. They have low attack rates. That's a sort of shallow initial curve, and their feeding rate doesn't really go too high on the y-axis, through to those species that are a little bit more impactful in terms of perhaps the attack rate and perhaps the height that the curve reaches. And also the nastiest of species are probably going to have a high attack rate and a very high maximum consumption rate. So we've illustrated that we can use these metrics to give a heat map. You can measure functional responses of a range of species, and you can see where they lie on this heat map. And in fact, Ross came up with a lovely figure here, that if you take what we call the functional response ratio, which is just the attack rate divided by the handling time, which gives you a metric of the overall impact in terms of the functional response curve. And invaders clearly have a much higher functional response ratio than natives, and that's significant. So again, we were exploring the metrics, applying them across taxonomic. This was done across a huge number of taxonomic groups, and we're beginning to see that perhaps we were onto something. But that's only part of the picture, of course. The amount of food or resource that an individual can consume is certainly part of the picture. But there's the other part of the picture is how many mouths are there, is a way I like to put it. If you have an invasive fish that eats a lot, obviously if there's not very many of those particular fish, there's not a lot in total being eaten. But if there's fish that eat a lot and there's a lot of those fish doing the eating, then that could be a major problem. And we know that invasive species tend to become more abundant over time. And in fact, going back to Parker's equation, as far back as 1999, the impact of invasive species was seen as its range, which I've illustrated here as a map. Invasive species have a small range, then they expand. Their abundance, how many of them there are, and what each individual does, the per capita effect. And that was well known, but it just hadn't really been translated into standard technique of ecology known as the functional response and numerical response. And there's work has been done on this way back into the 1940s. Another way to look at it is to say the total response, or impact perhaps, is the functional response, what individuals do, times the number of individuals doing the consumption. And that's kind of where we picked up and started to apply our technique with the second half of the equation, not just what individuals do, but how many individuals are doing that consumption and having that impact. So we came up with this simple, really, metric, the impact potential of an invasive species as a function of its per capita effect, functional response. So I've illustrated that by an individual invasive shrimp here killing a mayfly, and how many, in this case, shrimps there are doing that consumption. And obviously, high per capita consumption and lots of individuals of the invasive species could lead to lots of prey, lots of plants disappearing as they're consumed by the invader. Seems a fairly straightforward concept. So what we then did was we had a bit of an epiphany, and we said, well, let's combine these two elements, the per capita effect and the abundance of invaders, and say, well, how are they doing in relation to native species? And this simple little equation basically takes the per capita effect of the invader divided by the native, and let's say the abundance of the invader divided by the native, and it produces a little what we call index, what we call the relative impact potential index, that says if this index is greater than 1, then we're expecting to see the invader having impact because it's doing more than the native baseline. And in fact, what we found as we built more and more systems into our research in different species, at this point, that's going back to 2017, there's a lot more studies now, that in every system we looked at where there was massive invasion impact, we found that our RIP value was always greater than 1. So our RIP was predicting, as well as allowing us to understand which invaders were having impact and how much impact they would have. I've done a wee example for you here with the shrimps in Ireland. Basically, we looked at the feeding rate of the invader, which is the 17.76, the feeding rate of the native, 12.96, the abundance of the invader, 136 individuals per square meter, and the abundance of the native, 17 individuals per square meter. And you can see that the value is much greater than 1. That's illustrating that the invader is having more impact because it's doing more eating per individual, and there's more individuals doing the eating. And we did that for a variety of prey species, and it came out very tightly correlated with actual impact in the field. We know that mayfly disappear when the invader arrives. We know that blackfly disappear when the invader arrives. We've actually now discovered the mechanism, how we can measure it and understand it. And we could have predicted this. We could have said, well, this is going to be a nasty invader. And that's a huge leap forward in invasion ecology, to go from understanding to actual prediction. What we then did was we looked with the likes of Tony Ricciardi's scores of impact. So if you look at this bottom figure, it shows impact score from Ricciardi and Cohn. Impact score is 1 means the invader's not really having much of an impact. 7 means the invader is actually wiping out entire species and communities. So it's degree of impact. And we find it correlates extremely well with our RIP score across a whole range of taxa, from mitten crabs to hardwicke ladybirds, to gobies, to shrimps, to crayfish, to bivalves, to snails. And this pattern is really quite tight, that our RIP score is very predictive of impact in the field, or impact in the field is very much correlated with our RIP score. And you can use RIP scores now and the equation of this line. If you calculate the RIP of your particular invader that you're interested in finding out more about its impact, you can do the study and you can use this figure to see where your RIP score will be on the line and perhaps the impact that will occur in the field. So it's an understanding and predictive mechanism that we've managed to put together across all these taxonomic groups. If you want to read more on this, and this is being recorded. I can produce this as a PDF if you want as well. There's some key papers if you want to read them on the journey that we went through with a whole range of people. I can't claim this all to myself at all. Look at the range of people that we've been involved in across the world, including many in North America. There's Hugh McIsaac there. You've got South Africans, Dave Richardson, and so on. So to move on, another way of presenting this, especially when you want to get away from just figures and tables and numbers, is I stole this from the stable isotope people. The stable isotope do delta N, delta C, and various lovely pictograms. And Ross and I and others developed this idea that you can illustrate where a species sits on the functional response on the x-axis, abundance on the y, and you can see the roundhead. The round goby here, which you've all met in North America. Round gobies have very high FRs and very high abundance compared to bullheads, things like native species you see throughout Europe. So you can actually visualize the impact and the degree of impact compared to native species, not just in numbers, but also quite nicely visually. And Ross, for example, has brought some R code to this table, and you can use that to plug in the data you get from your experiments and see how your invader compares with your native. The other thing I'd like to say is that a lot of people use resource consumption, but in different ways and across what I would call the competition spectrum. And I think what the metric we've developed is really about interspecific competition when it comes to plants on the left-hand side. Plants have a limited number of things they use, water and various minerals and nutrients. They're static, they don't go far. Whereas generalist predators use a whole range of different prey species and are very mobile. So I think what we're looking at with functional responses in plant ecology is the relative interspecific competition, how plants compete over those resources, and you can measure that with functional responses, but like the gamba grass example. And it's really about impact when we look at generalist predators, as we call it, relative impact potential. And we explore these ideas in a lovely paper by Jaimie Dick and others on using the RIP to assess the ecological impacts of invasive alien species across these taxonomic trophic groups. And again, that's the beauty of this technique. We don't have to just apply it to insects or birds or crabs. We can apply it to everything and anything. And that's hopefully been bringing the invasion community a wee bit closer together. One of the big issues with invasive species is context. What contexts will change invasive species impact? This is a very quick example that when this particular invasive species has a parasite and at high temperatures, typical of future climate change, its feeding rate is enormous compared to where it's not parasitized and where there's lower temperatures. So contexts such as parasitism, contexts such as climate change, we can actually now incorporate, rather than it being a nuisance variable, we incorporate it into experiments, and we can be much more predictive about what invaders will do in future contexts. I'm conscious of time, so very quickly, I just want to show also that we've been able to come up with some models and ideas looking at the different stages of invasion. So clearly invasions start and invaders arrive, and invaders might start to replace native species and then proliferate. And we do see a lot of variation in invasive species impact in space and time, and that's sometimes hard to explain. I think this partially explains why that is. And we've done some studies also then to show that contexts such as, I'll show you an example in a moment, we might see that invasive species have different impacts in different contexts. I'll scoot forward to give you an example of this. The invasive round goby we know has major impacts in rivers and lakes across Europe and across North America, and it replaces what's called the native bullhead, very similar trophic ecology, but we tested this idea that we could look at the impact across invasion stages of this species and the native species towards a native prey, the amphipod. And what we found was, yes, we find differences in total impact depending on if it's just the arrival of the invasive species during replacement and proliferation. But we also found that the impact of the round goby was much higher at low oxygen concentrations. So low oxygen concentrations typical of future climate change, the invasive species does really, really well and may have major impacts. And again, this is a tool that is allowing us to predict what invaders will do in the future, which is so much better than just simple explanations of what's happened and then worrying we can't figure out what will happen because of context and changes. We now have a way that we can explore and consider predicting what invaders will do in the future, and hence for those practitioners who want to make a difference out in the field, as I do, as you do, you can actually set about, for example, in a case like this, we know that if oxygen in rivers goes down, invasive species have more impact. Maybe you could oxygenate rivers. It's done across the world. It's a pragmatic way of tackling invasive species impact. And I'm going to finish off fairly shortly, so we'll have time for Ross and time for questions and everything. We had quite a lot of debate in the invasion literature, which was fun. We proposed rather grandiosely that functional responses can unify invasion ecology. We had a response from a group that said that functional responses can't unify invasion ecology. And we came back with probably one of the best titles I've seen in a long time. We accused them of having fictional responses to our papers, and that led to actually a very good-natured debate. And that's what I think we need to do, is have a good-natured debate on the science and its integration into policy and practice. So you can follow what we've done through the literature. But what I'll finish on is to say that since those papers were published, a lovely piece of work by Larissa Freya and others showed that, and if you go to the top right figure there, the usage of the functional response on our metrics and invasion ecology has gone exponential since around 2007-10 there into 13-16. Many people are picking up on this technique and using it. There are gaps in where it's used geographically in the bottom left. There's a lot of studies that we've done in Europe that have been done in North America, some in South America, a lot in South Africa. We need to fill those gaps geographically. We need to fill the gaps taxonomically. There's not an awful lot of it done in some taxa. There's an awful lot done, for example, in crustaceans. But I think there's an exoneration here that the technique really has taken off and has become very popular. So listen, thank you for listening to that. There's plenty there for you to read. I'm going to now hand over to Ross, and then we'll field questions, both of us, at the end. Okay, Ross, and thank you very much for your attention to that, folks. Appreciate it.
Good. I think, Jaimie, you need to end your screen share. I think it's
Okay.
working now. That should be it now.
Oops.
Okay. Can you see my screen? Everything good? Okay. So yeah, switching gears, shifting seamlessly into the economic dimension of biological invasions. This is a lot of collaborative work I've done with folk around the world. So biological invasions have a lot of impacts. Like you heard from Jaimie, they of course have substantial ecological effects, including biodiversity declines, but they also have a range of socioeconomic consequences. So they can reduce crop yields, damage infrastructures, disrupt ecosystem services to humans, spread disease, and cost a lot of money. And as a result, invasions are implicated in pretty much all sustainable development goals. Some of these links, as you can see on the right-hand side, are stronger. So invasions, at least among the 100 of the world's worst, so-called taxa by the IUCN, link really strongly to things like life below water, life on land, good health and well-being, climate action, and so on. But there is a bit of a paradox in the field. So we have a lot of awareness of the ecological problems that invasions cause. We also know they have substantial health effects and socioeconomic implications. But despite this, compared to global changes like climate change, pollution, habitat degradation, biological invasions are sparsely known as a major problem, both by decision makers and the general public, in part because the process is quite complicated, quite full of different terminology, different words which mean the same thing. So it can be quite difficult sometimes to communicate the magnitude of the issue, or indeed what you're talking about at all. So we've been working a lot over the last 6 to 10 years on the INVICOS project. This project started 10 years ago. My involvement was in the last 5 or 6 of those, where we've basically created the first open updatable database of invasion costs. It's been hyper collaborative with over 150 experts from 40 countries around the world, and including both natural and social scientists. So we have biologists, we have economists, and other fields as well. And the kind of core aims are to raise public awareness and to compel decision making, to support efficient and cost-effective actions, and to help move invasions up the global environmental agenda. We've published now a lot of cost assessments, so many that we were able to write a review paper on our cost assessments. And the main topics or context through which we've done economic impact assessments is shown here. So we've done a range of studies looking at the economic costs of particular invasive taxa, particular geographic regions, including North America, individual countries like the UK, US and Mexico, different habitat types, different economic sectors, as well as more kind of creative conceptual studies. The list is kind of consistently growing over time. But kind of our headline figure, which was picked up in the IPBES report, is showing this exponential increase in both the damage and management costs from biological invasions. And I say exponential because the y-axis here is on a log scale, so the rate of increase is actually enormous. So in recent years, the economic costs have exceeded 400 billion US dollars based on our estimates. We can see that damage costs have superseded management costs in the last couple of decades. So what we're investing in management around the world isn't keeping pace with the amount of damage we're incurring from biological invasions. When we look at just the damages of invasive species and compare them to natural hazards, we see that they're actually pretty similar to things like storms, earthquakes, and floods, which are taken really seriously by decision makers, even more so than biological invasions. So the economic costs over 4 decades or so here was shown to be of a similar order of magnitude to those natural hazards. So perhaps we should consider invasions in a similar way. But more strikingly, the rate of increase in costs from invasions is much more rapid than other natural hazards. So invasion costs over the last 4 decades have risen by over 700%, which is really outstripping things like earthquakes, floods and storms. So not to diminish the threats from those other natural hazards, but it just shows the extent to which biological invasions are causing economic consequences. So we know that we're not spending enough on management compared to what we're incurring in damages, but we also know that how individual countries are spending their management budgets aren't necessarily efficient. So in the pyramid on the right-hand side here, we show how individual countries represented by the individual nodes are partitioning their total management expenditure towards biological invasions. And the 3 different axes reflect post-invasion spending, so things we do when invasive species have already arrived, so like control or eradication efforts. Pre-invasion in blue corresponds to more proactive measures such as biosecurity or rapid response, monitoring, and so on. And the green axis at the bottom corresponds to things like research or communications. And we can see that highlighted with the red circle at the top, most countries spend around 90 to 100% of their management budget reactively, whereas very few are investing large sums in relative terms proactively. So we're not really spending enough to prevent invasions happening in the first place, which creates this kind of wicked problem where we have to keep spending more and more to try and control populations, which are often difficult, if not impossible, to eradicate, especially in aquatic systems. So we've also been trying to motivate more proactive management. One thing with decision makers is that it's difficult to convince them to invest in something when the problem isn't there yet. So we've been leveraging first principles of invasion science, such as the invasion curve shown here, which shows the cumulative impact or the cumulative invaded area on the y-axis over time on the x-axis. And for an individual invasive population, we see that it shows this kind of S-shaped dynamic where populations are initially low as well as their impacts before they surge exponentially and then saturate at a high level. And the kind of bits of text sprinkled along the curve indicate the different management responses. So towards the bottom left, prevention or eradication is much more feasible, and eradication becomes much more difficult as we move towards the top right, where only local mitigation becomes possible. So we've been using this conceptual framework to build models which quantify the economic implications of management delay. So using the principles from the invasion curve, we built a cost of inaction model, and its fit is shown on the bottom right with different management delay scenarios shown on the x-axis and the cost of inaction shown on the y-axis. And the cost of inaction is basically the additional cost incurred due to management delay. And using our InvaCost database, we found that management actions are delayed globally per invasion by 11 years on average. And this has incurred an additional cost, which could have been avoided, of 1.2 trillion, which is reflected with the blue node on the curve on the bottom right. However, if we'd never tried to manage biological invasions, this could have risen to a much greater sum at 3.4 trillion, which is the point of saturation. And these models have allowed us to come up with quite strong messages, like each $1 of management being able to ultimately save around 54 in damages. Our cost data, we acknowledge, are quite biased, and it's something we want to address. So first of all, we have regional biases. Most economic costs have been reported in North America, particularly in the United States. As with Jaimie's map with the functional responses, we don't have a lot of data in many parts of the world. Costs are also very taxonomically biased. So on the figure on the right, we show the extent of underreporting across 3 different taxonomic levels: phyla, classes, and families. The gray components indicate the taxa within those groups that we don't have any cost information for, even though we know they have an invasion history. So we only have costs for around about 50% of phyla which contain an invasive species, and moving towards the family level, we don't have costs for around about 90% of those taxa. And indeed, we only have costs for about 2% of established invasive species globally, and this creates a massive level of underestimation. We also have substantial habitat biases. Most research in invasion biology focuses on the terrestrial realm. Indeed, most reporting of invasions is in the terrestrial realm. So we looked at how this plays out in terms of costs. So the figure on the right-hand side here shows a split between terrestrial and aquatic invasions across different contexts. And without going through each individual bar, on the far left, we have the numbers of established non-native species between the 2 realms. And we see that about 25–26% of established non-natives globally are in the aquatic realm, but only a much smaller percent as we move to the 4th bar in is from aquatic invasion costs at around 345 billion. If we invest proportionately in managing aquatic invasions compared to the numbers of aquatic invaders globally, we should be spending an extra 39 billion on trying to eradicate aquatic invasive species. So it seems that what we're investing in aquatic systems in particular isn't keeping pace with the invasion rates towards that realm. So in light of all of these gaps, we've been moving towards more predictive studies, where we've been trying to fill knowledge gaps in invasion costs across 3 different dimensions. So trying to fill gaps through space and time, trying to fill gaps across different taxonomic groups and across different economic sectors. So a paper we had accepted in the last few weeks linked species distribution models with macroeconomic predictor variables, so things like agricultural output around different countries. And in doing this, we were able to forecast what costs could be for invasive species around the world based on the economic characteristics of the places they've invaded. And this really surged what our invasion costs are by hundreds of thousands of percentage points. It also allowed us to produce really high resolution heat maps of where the economic costs of invasions around the world are highest. So in particular, the UK has the highest invasion cost per unit area based on our forecasts, but also places like the East Coast of the United States and indeed much of Europe. And this largely links to things like agricultural output, because we know agriculture is pretty severely impacted by invasions. In another paper, which just came out last week, we looked at trait profiles across tetrapods, so amphibians, birds, mammals, and reptiles, which are linked to costs. And again, without going through everything here, we identified some traits which link to higher economic impacts across species. So for example, in birds, we found that those which live longer tend to have higher costs, or those which fledge earlier. For mammals, we found those with a particular dietary pattern would have a higher cost, or those with a higher fecundity. For reptiles, we again found signals in terms of dietary patterns or female maturity timings. So these traits then allow us to potentially predict which species in future could become problematic economically if they share traits with the species which are currently causing the largest impacts. And this feeds into a framework which we're currently developing, which maps the economic costs of biological invasions and the traits linked to those economic costs to the different stages of the invasion process. And I don't really have time to get into this in great depth, but basically we indicate that costs can occur across all invasion stages shown in blue, both in terms of damage and management, and the extent of these costs are underpinned by the economic activity of a given country. So it's really a lock and key mechanism where the economic activity of a given country, so the sectors which are prevalent, will influence the effect of any given invasive species on that sector. So, you know, a particular invasive insect could be linked to a particular agricultural product, for example. The traits of species ultimately underpin their potential to cause these costs, but in particular at the bottom, evolution of these traits is also really important. So species can bring traits to their new ranges, but then they can change over time due to a range of adaptive and non-adaptive processes. So this framework really bolts on evolutionary theory and economic activity to the existing kind of stage-based invasion process. Lastly, we've been forecasting what the costs could be across different economic sectors using data from KEYNOTE. So we looked at which species are in KEYNOTE but which don't have economic costs reported. And using different Bayesian or distributional scenarios, we forecasted the increase in costs to agriculture, fisheries, and forestry, which are several times what they are currently. So we've been making good progress in terms of creating a more realistic estimate of what the costs are while accounting for biases. So to kind of finish up, invasive species have a lot of impacts ecologically, economically, and in terms of health. Quantifying monetary impacts improves communications. People understand money pretty well. Decision makers certainly understand money. And therefore, by quantifying economic costs, we're able to motivate more timely management actions. And to really combat the issue of biological invasions, we've shown that we need more proactive management strategies and that international cooperation and collaboration is essential. So as mentioned, I just want to quickly plug our international conference on aquatic invasive species. You may not know what you're doing in August 2026, but we have a good idea. So with the Invasive Species Centre, Jaimie and I at Queen's are hosting the 24th ICAIS conference. Our theme is transcending boundaries. So we're looking to leverage perspectives on invasion science across different habitat types, across different world regions, across science policy interface, and across different scientific disciplines. So really looking to be integrative in our conference program. So look forward to seeing you at this conference. It's going to be held on the really historic Queen's University Belfast campus, but of course we have lots of our own aquatic invasion problems, which hopefully this will provide a forum to address. So in terms of both local and global issues. I don't know if you want to add to that, Jaimie.
See you in Belfast.
We also have a range of partnership options at the minute. If you fancy sponsoring the conference in any way, we can certainly discuss that. So do get in touch.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, both Jaimie and Ross. We really appreciated that great presentation. And I think that both of your talks kind of really gave place to the transcending boundaries theme. I know Jaimie talked a lot about not just relevant to aquatic invasives. I'm a forestry invasives person myself, and I wrote down a lot of notes through both of your presentations for my own work. And I saw in the chat that a lot of people are feeling the same. So really appreciate that. And as both of them mentioned, check out the Aquatic Invasive Species Conference. If you have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A box. I'll leave it open for another couple of minutes. I'm just scrolling through the chat, lots and lots of comments, but I'm not seeing any particular questions offhand. So if I'm missing any, like I said, please pop them in the Q&A. But I think that both your talks generated a lot of great conversation in the chat, which is really what our keynotes are supposed to do. So I guess if there's no questions, we can maybe pop off. Oh, wait. Oh, we just had in the chat, Lauren just put in some information about the upcoming Aquatic Invasive Species Conference if you're interested in that. So I'll maybe let us have a little extra couple minutes of break before we lead into the next session. And big thanks again to Jaimie and Ross for your time this afternoon.
Be in touch, anyone, about anything to do with our talks or the conference. Please email us. The emails are in the chat. And thanks for your attention.
Jaimie and Ross,
Thanks, everyone.
One question come in if you have another minute. Sadia asked if you have looked at the socioeconomic status of the affected countries or communities.
Yeah, we have. So we find that countries which are less economically developed can be much more susceptible to the economic costs of biological invasions. So as a proportion of their GDP, they can have a much more severe consequence, even if the raw costs are much lower. So for example, if a developing country is reliant on one particular agricultural product or another kind of product, it's really susceptible to a particular invasion if it happens to affect that bit of production. So the susceptibility can be really pronounced in less wealthy countries, but also cumulative wealth around the world is a really good predictor for invasions and costs. So in terms of absolute impacts, countries which are wealthier tend to incur higher costs because they have more of an economy to damage.
Awesome, thank you. That's very interesting. And I'm sure you could take a look at more of Ross's work to learn more about that. Okay, Jaimie and Ross's emails in the chat and in our ongoing document. Please get in touch with them if you have any further questions, and I'll let you free for your bathroom breaks until the next session. Thanks all. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.